Lawyers of Reddit, what's the dumbest thing you've had to explain to a client? No, you dingus. Self-defense does not mean he punches you in the face, and then 2 weeks later you go to his house, ring his doorbell, and kick the shit out of him. By far and away the strangest thing I have ever had to explain to a client is how to use an elevator. Our courtroom was on the 4th floor, and she needed to take an elevator to get there. I had to describe how you get in, push E4 and then get out when the lights above show she's on floor 4. Yeah. The dumbest legal thing I've had to explain is that you can't terminate your parental rights voluntarily and then request visitation with that child. I once had a client who wanted to declare bankruptcy. I explained he needed to have his tax returns for the past few years filed in order to do so. He said he hadn't filed taxes in 20 years because it ain't none of the government's business how much money I make. Apostrophe. I don't understand. People make it sound like the eyes will throw you in a federal penitentiary if you ever dared not file taxes, but some guy can just not file for 2 decades and have nothing happen to him? Can someone explain to me how that is possible? I had to explain to a client why their ex-husband could travel with their child to Florida without obtaining a passport. As in, I had to tell them that Florida was part of the United States. Were they flying? I know a couple of people, especially those that have never left their state or are immigrants, that associated flying with passports. I knew many Americans have never left their country, and while that feels a bit strange to me, it is actually understandable, since US is so huge. But never leaving the state? I mean states in US can be huge too, so it should be understandable too, but it feels bizarre to me that they had to pay me. This is more common than you'd think. For some reason, some people think lawyers are like their personal spiritual guides or fairy godmother. It doesn't matter if you were sober or not. You jumped out of a 3rd-story window with a beer bottle and threw it at a cop. The jury is going to think you were drunk. Also, I think you were drunk. From this week, client, so I don't smoke meth. I think it's from unprotected 6 me. So you would like me to explain to the judge it's okay, you just bang meth heads client, yeah. Did this person fail a drug test and try to convince a court that the meth in their system was from unprotected 6? That he hadn't really won a 20 million euros European super lottery from Australia that he'd never entered, and that it was a good thing that his family, bank, and church wouldn't lend him the $2,000 they said they needed to verify his identity, on top of the several hundred he'd already sent them, and that yes, his priest was right, it was a scam. This was during a clinic at a free community legal center. The poor guy had limited English and only $20 left in his bank account, and he really did not want to let go of the 20 million euro dream. His priest had sent him to us for advice because he wasn't having any luck talking sense into the old guy himself and thought lawyers might help. Not a client per se, but a victim. Had to explain what the word ejaculate meant. Defense attorney asked if the defendant ejaculated, and she said no. On redirect I explained that the word meant something came out of his penis, and she said oh, then yes. Not the brightest person I've ever met. That your boss sending you to a drug test after he walked in on you snorting cocaine off your desk does not qualify as entrapment. You cannot sue him. Don't signal to the judge you need to use the restroom during your trial by making eye contact and vigorously nodding while urgently pointing at your crotch. I went on a date with a lawyer recently who told me he had to be at work at 9 AM the next day to explain to someone that he could, in fact, be fired for killing someone with a company vehicle. I was contacted by a couple who had paid for a trip to see the midnight sun in northern Norway. They wanted to sue the travel agency when they found out it was the same sun as always. I had to explain that there's only a single sun and that they can't sue a travel agency for selling a midnight sun trip. Every year one of the travel agencies publishes a list of the most ridiculous complaints they received. They're hilarious. Last year someone complained the beach was too sandy. Another good one was that they hadn't told the couple that a lot of beaches can be topless, and the husband became distracted. I work on appeals, which means I spend more time with the law than with real people, but the law has some gems, like this dude, who really happened. At the police station, the arresting officer advised defendant, both orally and with a consent form, of his constitutional rights pursuant to Miranda v. Arizona, 384 U.S. 436, 86s, Court, 1602, 16L, edition. Second 694, 1966. Defendant refused to sign the consent form and stated that he would never waive his rights. At the same time, however, he asked the arresting officer whether he could speak to him man-to-man. At this point, a detective with the task force entered the room with the evidence of the drugs gathered from the inventory search of the Corvette and advised defendant of the charges that would be filed against him. To this, defendant responded, "You think this is big time? This ain't shit." The detective then asked defendant whether he was willing to provide them any information, and defendant responded that, if he were released with his drugs in his possession that night, he would call the police occasionally with information on certain persons he felt needed to be off the streets. The detective then started to leave the booking area, and defendant said, "And I want my sheet back." When the detective asked him whether he was referring to the drugs discovered in the Corvette, defendant responded that he was. File that under "You should definitely exercise that right to remain silent." Apostrophe. Why they should not have called the cops to tell them exactly what they did that violated the restraining order. My colleague had a case where the client went over to the protected party's house. They weren't there. Then he called the cops and told them he was breaking the protective order. A lawyer can't out and out lie. You said to them, "Yeah, I burned his ducking house down and pissed on the ashes." He can't say you were 2 states away. That blew some my students' heads. When I was volunteering at teen court in college, I had a kid who burned down a few hundred acres, a half dozen houses. As soon I go, "Let's talk about how to handle this." He goes, "I did it. I was bored and I wanted to see if I could catch that field on fire. And then when I spread, I figured duck it, they have insurance," and left without calling the cops. Totally confused when I told the judge I need to be relieved after he started lying his ass off about it in court. In my state we have this thing called victims compensation. An oversimplification of how it works goes as follows. If you are the victim of a crime and suffer some form of injury, e.g. psychological, physical, etc., you can apply for a payment from state funds. If you are the perpetrator of one of those crimes, e.g. an assault, robbery, pedophilia, etc., an order can be made for you to pay the state back an amount relating to that victim's compensation. I had a client who felt the process of being convicted for assaulting his relatives and having to pay victims' compensation back to the state was arduous. And in return, he should be receiving victims' compensation from the state. So that was fun to explain. Edit. Explanation was you are not the victim in that. Not to a client, but other party. I was acting for a particular manufacturer. They were sued for an injury incurred by someone using a product made by a different manufacturer. I rang their lawyer and said I was acting for A and I didn't understand why A had been named as defendant in the suit, but the body of the claim said the plaintiff had been injured by a product made by B. I asked if it was a monster typo or what. The response was that they thought A was the manufacturer of products sold under the name B. Now that isn't inherently stupid, I guess. So I said that had no basis in fact whatsoever, and that A and B were unrelated competitors, and asked, as a matter of curiosity, how they had reached the conclusion that A were the manufacturer of B. The response was along the lines of someone in the office, I think it was maybe Jim, one of our clerks, who thought he'd read somewhere that B were made by A. That was it. No checking of the product paperwork. No company searches. No brand name register searches. No inquiries with our client or B. Not even an F in Google. Just some guy in the office had once heard. And on that basis they issued a very financially sizable product liability suit. I once had to explain to a client that he could, in fact, fire an employee for 1. Stealing significant sums of money from the safe, 2. Pulling a gun on a co-worker who questioned these activities, and 3. Waving said gun in a customer's face moments later, all of which were on camera. Represented a client charged with statutory rape who had a large number of Explanations for the various evidence in his case that I had to explain would not be a good idea to testify to or argue to the jury. The Kai jelly you purchased with the kid at Walmart was not for applying to an undiagnosed skin condition on your chest. The hundreds of pages of internet chat logs prior to traveling hundreds of miles to meet the kid, consisting of repeated explicit sexual overtures, emotional manipulation, lies about your age and wealth, and specific plans for how you would remove him from his parents' home were not meaningless banter. The fact that you had an active prescription for Viagra does not mean you are asexual. The semen matching your DNA did not find its way into the rectum of the 13-year-old boy because of your medical condition that results in leakage in the fact that when you are staying in a hotel room, you do not lift the toilet seat when you urinate, which must have resulted in the material being deposited on the seat and transferred to the boy when he sat on the seat. You were not the victim taken advantage of by the hypersexual teenager for whom you were merely trying to provide innocent emotional support. He had to explain all of these things and others many times. I'm not sure he ever actually believed any of them. I recently had a call from a guy who found out that Long John Silver's was microwaving his baked shrimp combo. He wanted to eat there for every meal for a year and then sue them for false advertising. He changed his mind when I suggested that he would probably die of a heart attack before reaching his 1-year goal. That the presence of yellow fringe on the flags in the courtroom do not mean that the court is an admiralty court without jurisdiction to hear the client's criminal case. Sovereign citizens are something else. I was clerking in a bankruptcy court and we had a case where the petitioners were a group of men that had a mix of ideologies between sovereign citizenship, the redemption movement and strawman theory. They believed that an individual has two personas, one the real flesh and blood human being and the other a separate legal personality or person, usually written in capitals, who is a strawman, and that the strawman is responsible for all their debts, liabilities, taxes and legal responsibilities belong to the strawman rather than the physical individual themselves. Also that when you're born the government puts $630,000 in an account for the strawman and somehow you can write checks off that account using the UCC. Basically the petitions went into a Cadillac dealership and presented these strawman checks and demanded cars. The dealership calls the police and they are arrested for fraud. Then the petitioners attempted to force the dealership into involuntary bankruptcy so they could get the cars. There were 3 petitioners and they all were pro-SE, so needless to say the motions were ridiculous and unintelligible. And this was on my second day as a clerk. Here is the legal brief that discusses the case and facts a little more. Casa text. Com Casinri Cadillac by Delarian Bangrando Hio 2002. I watched a RFL Supreme Court appeal over a murder case. The guy killed several people with a baseball bat and wanted his sentence mitigated because he had PTSD. He claimed he had PTSD from experiencing the murder he committed. The court had to explain to him that a mental issue acquired while committing a crime cannot mitigate the crime you committed. When a client called me this past Memorial Day and I asked why she was calling me on a holiday, she replied that she didn't think Jews celebrated Memorial Day. Never thought that I would have to explain that to anyone. Edit. To answer some of the questions. Yes, I'm Jewish. No, I never told her I was Jewish. I have an answering service which took her call and emailed me the message, which was that it was very urgent that she speak with me that day, given that the courts were closed and her case was a paternity and child support matter. I thought it had to be quite the emergency. It was not. She just wanted to ask whether the suspected father was required to take the DNA test ordered by the court. I then had to explain what paternity meant. I had a mediation last week with a client on a really crappy case and managed to settle for a decent amount. I then explained to the plaintiff her share of the settlement after paying the bill. She was confused, so I explained that I was speaking about our fee and expenses. She got upset because we were taking her money. I had to explain what a contingency contract was and how we were compensated for our services. The conversation took a turn for the absurd when I had to explain I did not work for free. I once had to explain what a maiden name was. They had no idea. Similarly, with a different client, I tried to explain why they needed to fill out the intake questionnaire. I was explaining that I need information such as their name, address, and date of birth in order to draft paperwork. Their response: "Why do I have to do this? What did I even hire you for? You're useless. If I have to do all this work, I might as well represent myself." They were super pissed and stomped out the front door. "Sorry, I don't magically know your date of birth." Edit. As for the maiden name, it was a very small country town. This person was most definitely a native English speaker. As for the questionnaire, someone asked why we don't just ask for a driver's license. The questionnaire was about 2 or 3 pages long and also needed other information such as any previous names, social security number, children's names, etc. Not the dumbest, but the one I have the most problem with is attorney-client privilege. It's only a secret and safe from discovery from the other side. If you keep a secret, don't forward my emails to other people. Don't talk about your case. Keep it a secret. Well, from the other side, I once missed a court date and assumed that had put me in even deeper legal trouble. My lawyer then had to explain to me that dodging his calls to avoid being arrested was just dumb and the exact wrong course of action. If it helps, we get it all the time. And the law profession is full of those with anxiety depression, both issues that can make you want to avoid facing stuff. Personally, I totally get why my clients would avoid the shit out of their problems. I hate opening my mail, but tell my clients on the regular not to avoid this. So your attorney didn't necessarily think you were an idiot. He would have just cringed at the hole he knew you were digging for yourself. Not a lawyer, but a friend of my dad once tried to sue him. Why? Because his dad, the friends, had died, and since my dad was like a father to his friend, he should give him money every month just like his dad did when he was alive. Apparently the lawyer just said that's not how it works. Apostrophe. I have to explain to clients on a daily basis that yes, you do have to actually pay for that house you are buying. If your mortgage company hasn't given us the money yet, or you didn't arrange for them to give enough money, then you cannot pay for house, and house is not yours. And no, I cannot give you keys to house before it is yours. Bankruptcy attorney here. If you know you're coming to my office to file bankruptcy, do not make major financial decisions before you talk to me. E.g. cashing out your 401k, paying your family members the money you owe them, buying a car with no intention of paying off the loan, etc. The court allows you to discharge your debt, and the only thing they ask is for you to be honest and not sneaky about it. You gotta respect the process. Edit. I'm getting a lot of questions about personal situations, but I'm not here to provide legal advice. If you are considering bankruptcy, speak to an attorney sooner than later. Most will provide a free consultation, and the longer you wait, the more problematic your situation may become.